Welcome to Esperanza Fonseca. She is a labor and policy organizer. She's a sex trade survivor and a member of a firm. Is that the proper way of saying it? Because there's a symbol in it. We can put it in the information on the bottom.
Yeah, that's the correct way of saying it. AFFIRM stands for Association of Feminists Fighting Fascism, Imperialism, Marginalization, and Refeudalization. It's a mouthful, but thank you for having me on today.
Of course. So you've written quite a bit. There's this Medium post which we'll put up in the information as well on the page. But you wrote about your experience being in sex work. And specifically from a socialist feminist perspective, which is a big part of our show, we do these Fridays to educate folks a little bit more about what it really means to fight for an all-inclusive, women's movement that also talks about class and labor issues and race and of course all these things that are intersectional. So in this piece, I think what really got me just at the top was, you do not call yourself a sex worker. You actually call yourself a prostitute. So can you explain why that's the case?
Yeah, definitely. So, the first thing I want to say is that I think a lot of really well-meaning people use the term sex work because they recognize that there is a big stigma against people, especially women, especially trans women, in the sex trade. But for me, I find the term to be a bit too broad and too general to be able to, one, name my specific experience as a prostitute and not as, a porn actor or a stripper or an exotic dancer, but specifically as a prostitute within the sex trade. And secondly, because in attempting an analysis of the sex trade, it's necessary to have a term that demarcates the difference between prostitution and other forms of sex work. And so for me, I also, as a Marxist and not a postmodernist, I don't believe that changing words necessarily changes material reality. Right. And so while there is some stigma associated with it, I prefer the term prostitute.
So you started your work. I mean, in this piece, you talk about the first time you ever were approached by a man on the street. How long were you, for the sake of this, in sex work, in prostitution work? I don't know if that doesn't roll off your tongue the right way, but I'm like...
Yeah, so I think it was around 2 to 3 years that I was really in the sex trade. Okay,
so you started, how old were you when you started?
I think I was around 25, and then, exited at 27, 28.
And, the crazy thing is you're literally traded. It's not like you're an independent. I mean, the problem is there's been this glamorous take on this in the media. And the realities are, especially for the transgender community, is extremely dangerous. The murder rate is horribly high. And you mentioned in the piece that it has been glamorized so that a lot of people end up going to it for quick and easy work, but not understanding the circumstances behind it. So what was your experience like?
Yeah, so, the first thing that I want to say is, speaking as a trans woman, the process of transition is so difficult, right? It could be really messy, especially when, you're not independently wealthy and maybe have the money to pay for surgeries and treatments that you want. And it's a really hard time. And despite the fact that, I had a college degree, I was, a labor professional within the union movement, when I started my transition, I ended up losing my job. When I lost my job, I lost my housing. And I also
Why did you lose your job? What was the...
I think it was a combination of transition being really hard on me as an individual, but also on, discriminatory attitudes on the basis of my direct supervisor and others, because I was doing political and policy work. So I was sort of the face of the union to different, political figures in, I think, 7 different counties.
Wow.
But, when I had lost my job, life got really hard. And in the trans community, I mean, most of us have either been in the sex trade or have friends that are in the sex trade. And it's often, painted as this, oh, you're just so beautiful. You're a woman that men will pay you. You could pay for everything, that you were never able to before. And you can get validation for your gender. And so I had a friend who sort of linked her arm with me and took me down the street. And, I had that first client. And in the beginning, it seemed sort of empowering, right? Like, oh my God, like a man actually finds me attractive enough to offer me money for this. Quickly, that illusion completely disappeared and it became a trap that I could not escape.
How so?
So, in a few different ways. The first thing I want to say, which I think is really downplayed among people, are the psychological and emotional effects of being in the sex trade. And it's not this sort of, moralistic, oh, my body's being defiled by, having sex with these men. I think it goes deeper than that. And it is the psychological effect of being treated like a commodity or like an object, specifically a sexual object by men, sort of being denied, intimacy, emotion, affection, and sort of all of those things being mediated through a cash transaction. And it gets very hard. So that's the psychological aspect. The second thing, and probably the most important, is the economic aspect. When you look at scholarship on the sex trade, it's completely diametrically opposed to the narrative that we see from, media such as Business Insider that paints sex work as this, you can get out of poverty. In fact, if you just get an OnlyFans, you can even buy your own house, but when you look at the scholarship, you see that most women who enter the sex trade because of poverty do not exit the sex trade out of poverty. They stay in poverty. And so because you're not fixing the economic reason, economic impetus that put you into the sex trade, it is that much harder to get out of it.
So you broke down two different aspects. There's a psychological effect of the sex trade, and then there's the actual economic effect. And of course, if there were fair labor standards, et cetera, it would impact some of the psychological effect. But there's a very real conversation. I sometimes get involved in them on Twitter, and I just have to back off because I'm not an expert. But there's a very real conversation. I hear it a lot that at the end of the day, even if sex work is if it's unionized, like it is in states like Nevada, there's still this misogyny that carries a psychological effect that hurts anybody who's in that trade.
Yeah. So, I think whenever the concept of, unionization comes up, I have a really sort of particular experience that I'm not sure many others share, which is that I was a union organizer before the sex trade and I was a union organizer after the sex trade. And so I always, think that the unionization argument is a little weak for a few reasons. The first is that we have to look at, the sex trade for what it is, right? Which is sort of a relationship between the buyer or the John, the client, whatever you want to call him, and the bot, the sex worker, the prostitute, whatever you want to refer to her as. The buyer always has, the power in the interaction because he's the one with the money. She needs money more than he needs sex, right? She needs to pay her rent more than he needs intimacy, validation, whatever he gets from that interaction. And so in countries where prostitution was legalized or decriminalized and, unions formed, you have reports from women who said, although some things have changed, he still holds the power. And I think that is why, one of the biggest reasons why, efforts at reforming laws around the sex trade will fail because they don't change the fundamental relationship of power.
That's right. And the fact that these women need the funds, that they have to resort to the sex work. So you were taken by the hand into the street, your first transaction, and then after that, what happened? I mean, was there a pimp? Was there somebody who was working you after that? Did you? I'm just very curious how you go from that stage to the next.
Yeah. So, I had recently lost my job. I started sort of dabbling in the sex trade to, get money. And I started to see it as like, wow, maybe I don't need a job, like I was kind of traumatized with the way that I was treated at my previous job. And as a trans woman, I just felt completely like an outsider, like if normal society doesn't want me, why should I want to be in normal society if I can make my own money? So I, had friends who taught me how to post ads on starting out with Craigslist, then moving to Backpage. And it is just sort of a trap. I think those of us who come from really working class families, especially in communities of color, a lot of our families hustled in some way when they were younger. So, my dad, I remember him telling me, like, look, fast money will suck you in quickly, but fast money goes just as quickly as it comes. And I think I learned that lesson after. But it was that fast money that sort of sucked me into that world. And then again, right, the longer I stayed in it, the harder it was to leave. And I see that with many of my friends who are, still in the sex trade today.
Were you allowed to leave?
So I guess this is connected to the earlier question of, pimping. I think for most trans women in the US, we don't have pimps, although, there are definitely some. But, when you talk about like, can you leave the sex trade? One is that for most women, there are no other options, right? So, I have a friend who started in the sex trade at 16. She's 24 now. She has no other training, no other experience. Where is she supposed to go? A fast food job, that's not going to allow her to survive. So one, there's no other options, and two, again, it's just that when you have trauma that keeps getting compounded on more trauma, psychologically, it becomes a lot harder to exit, especially when the use of drugs and other substances come in to mitigate the effects of that trauma. And we know from the data that sexual, physical, and emotional trauma permeates the sex trade.
So how were you able to get out of it?
So again, I had a degree, I had a resume, and I still had some connections that were able to help me. But even then, it was one of the most difficult and trying periods in my life. So, I write in my letter that I experienced sexual violence at, on multiple occasions in the sex trade. But it was the last time that I experienced it that was the most brutal. I won't go too deep in because I just don't think it's appropriate, but, I was restrained, tied up. It was really bad. I ended up having to go to the emergency room after to get put on PEP so that, I didn't contract HIV. But afterwards, no matter how much I wanted to, my body would not open up to these men. So at the time, my mom was misdiagnosed with cancer. I had to pay rent every month, and it felt like the whole world was falling on me. So I would see clients, but I would trick them. I would not have sex with them because I couldn't. And it just got so bad that in myself, I decided, if it's between having to see these men or be on the streets, I'm going to be on the streets. So I actually went homeless. I was, looking for shelters. Most of the shelters in Los Angeles, Orange, and Ventura counties were completely booked. There was 6 to 12-month waiting periods. I ended up getting into one shelter, which itself had problems, but even myself, with the privileges that I do have, I was still on the streets trying to exit the sex trade, and there were no resources to help me.
Unreal. There's two things I want to ask you just about the stigma of sex trade. Were you afraid at any moment that law enforcement, or did you ever have any interactions with law enforcement, and with that, the effect it would have on your long-term goals?
Yeah. So in terms of the stigma, I was never too concerned about that. I am a person who, look, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to stand behind it, right? Otherwise, I just shouldn't do it. I'm very open about my past. In terms of law enforcement, there was a time where these two police officers had profiled my friend and I for being transgender, walking out of a hotel at night, and they pulled us over and were pretty terrible to us. Thankfully, I've had interactions with the police before, so I was able to handle it, and ultimately they backed off. But in terms of, law enforcement, charging me with a crime, I was prepared to fight that.
Okay, now you're an advocate, and you write about. I think that this piece is really powerful, just for folks. I think you should definitely take a look at it, because I think it challenges a lot of the assumptions, and a lot of like you said, there's this other side of it where it's almost become a movement in terms of how sex work, sex work is work is work is work. We say that as a line, and of course it is, but there's an alternative where I think folks are having difficulty, especially if they're not part of that community, kind of digging in a little bit deeper and assessing it. What are your goals in educating folks? What should the community, even let's just say that the DSA community and the left do to really advance what you're fighting for?
Yeah, so this is a great question, because I think that as the left today, we really have to question the dominant narrative around the sex trade. As a union organizer, I've organized hotel workers at Disneyland, I've organized McDonald's workers, I've organized Walmart workers. And if an organizer or an organization is pro-industry, they are not pro-worker. And you see this, when we organize fast food workers, we don't say, fast food work is work. We say, let's talk about the exploitation of McDonald's, of Burger King, of the industry. Let's talk about how they prey on the vulnerability of immigrant workers, of women, single moms who need to support their families. And yet in the sex trade movement, what you see is that people are very pro-industry, and it's actually been documented throughout, decades that, pro-sex trade, so-called prostitute unions typically advocate for the interests of pimps and johns more than they do for women in prostitution themselves. And so as the left, especially people who call ourselves socialist, we have to have a position on the sex trade that is pro-worker, pro-women, but anti-industry. And that is the message that I want to get across, which is that you can be pro-women, pro-sex worker, but by no means should you be pro-industry. The sex industry is one of the most exploitative and violent industries today, and it has been throughout history. And if you are pro-industry, you are not a leftist and you are not a socialist.
So this is a strange question, but there was this huge write-up in the New York Times about OnlyFans and also about Pamela Anderson, right? And she is a socialist. She is on the left. She's written for Jacobin. This is not, the idea, for those of you who didn't know that. She really thinks deeply about these issues, and she's very pro-sex. How do you communicate with that message simultaneously? Being pro-sex and owning and being paid for your work, but also challenging the industry itself.
Yeah. So, one is just that I think a lot of people confuse my perspective with this sort of moralistic anti-sex perspective.
Right.
I'm not anti-sex, right? And the reason why is because my opposition to the sex trade is not rooted in, religious or, bourgeois morality. It's rooted in the simple fact that this is an industry which, thrives on vulnerability, recruits from the most oppressed, hyper-exploited classes of women and queer people, and traps them in there, often unable to leave, unable to exit. And so, I think that, when we talk about being pro-sex, I am for the liberation of our bodies and our sexualities. But that doesn't mean that I don't see the role of the market. And that sounds a little confusing. So let me just explain that in a much clearer way. The left nowadays often talks about the state, but we don't talk about capitalism enough. And so when we talk about sexual liberation, we talk about getting state involvement and regulation off of our bodies and off of our sexualities. But we forget that if our sexualities and bodies are controlled by the market, that is also a form of oppression. And so I want our sexualities, our reproductive capacities to be liberated, not just from state control, but also from control of the market. And I think that is a real politic of sexual liberation.
Esperanza, fascinating. I wish I could talk to you for another half an hour. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.